at an unprecedented pace and highlighting its assertiveness to become a global leader. Moreover, China's interest in Europe is increasingly expanding into new areas. But while Beijing is becoming a key player in European affairs, European countries are still struggling to find a coherent approach at EU level due to their diverging interests and views concerning China's presence in their economies. During the pandemic, there have been mixed feelings within the EU about the way China handled the crisis and used the provision of medical aids for propaganda purposes. And it also highlighted a clear EU's overdependence on imports from China, especially of viral drugs. This crisis showed that some changes have to be made by the EU in its relationship with China. And since neither the EU or Beijing can thrive without one another, we have decided to organize this panel with the aim of understanding how the diplomatic and economic ties between Brussels and Beijing might change in the future. On behalf of OCA Europe, I'm happy to present today's speakers, the member of the European Parliament, Iuliu Winkler, Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Committee on International Trade, Henri Malosse, former President and member of the European Economic and Social Committee, Tim Rühling, Senior Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Richard Ghiasy, Senior Fellow at the Leiden Asia Center, and Stuart Lau, Europe Correspondent to South China Morning Post, who will be the moderator of the panel. The member of the European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer, was also supposed to be our fifth speaker, but unfortunately he had to attend a parliamentary engagement and therefore he cannot join us today. The panel will be divided into 2 rounds of questions to the speakers, then followed by a Q&A session and the conclusion. I remind you that this virtual panel is recorded and broadcasted. I leave the floor to Mr. Lau. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here to be today's moderator. And without further delay, we can maybe move on to our next session, which is the Q&A sessions with the fellow distinguished guests. So why don't we start with Mr. Winkler, because of course there's a lot of attention about the investment agreement, not just throughout the last year, but also in yesterday's EU-China summit as well. President von der Leyen has been basically calling on her Chinese counterparts to speed up with the process and to sort of level up the political attention for the investment agreement before any meaningful deal could be struck by year end. You sit in the European Parliament and you sit especially on this Committee on Trade. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you think about the process so far, and do you think China is giving the EU enough promise?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Of course, it would have been wonderful that my colleague, Mr. Bütikofer, can attend also, because he is the chair of the delegation of the European Parliament with China. And as such, of course, they are dealing with a lot of issues, but also the political ones. And as we could see in the last weeks, and as we could see yesterday also in the EU-China summit, virtual summit, of course, political issues and debate about the values, global values, European values, universal values, and call them as you wish, is a very important debate also in the EU-China bilateral relations. By the way, Mr. Lau, I congratulate you on your article this morning in the South China Morning Post. Very good article, and I think that it catches something that is happening in the European Union at the level of the European institutions, namely an effort to sort out China policy for the European Union. And this, of course, is not easy at all. It's not easy at all. having in mind the diversity of China, having in mind the diversity of the European Union and its 27 member states, and also having in mind the volatility of our international arena, even if we speak about trade or if we speak about geopolitics or international relations. So without entering in the political context, I would like to try to answer a little bit to your question about how we stand with the investment agreement and what are the mindsets in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament. One sentence as a forward. As you know, after the Lisbon Treaty, after 2009, the European Parliament has expanded its competencies, and especially in the field of trade, the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament has a little bit expanded in two directions. First of all, in monitoring the negotiations, all the negotiations, but of course we are also monitoring very carefully the EU-China investment agreement negotiations. And the second direction to expand, which is a plan for the future, but we have already started to do so, is monitoring or overseeing the implementation of trade agreements. And this is our new situation, our new role, and we have a right to say no. We have a right to say no. We are not at the negotiating table as a European Parliament, but we will have to ratify any agreement that will be signed by the parties. How we stand now? Of course, we had many rounds of the investment agreement negotiation. Even we had some rounds lately on video conference, because the COVID, of course, the pandemic has touched also on the negotiations. We had even yesterday the EU-China summit on video conference. So we have to adapt to the new situation, to the new realities. What we have as a prelude of the investment agreement is the so-called Geographic Indications Agreement, and I'm sure that you are all you know that the EU and China has signed the Geographic Indications Agreement last November. This agreement protects 100 European geographic indications in China, and also 100 Chinese indications in the European agreement. It is not such a big deal if you talk money, but it is very important for the European way of life. And it is very important because a geographic indication protecting a product as coming from a certain region of the European Union, a certain European region, this is, I think, also part of European identity. And this agreement will come to our International Trade Committee starting September. Now we wait for the Council, but as far as I know, in the next 2 weeks, the European Council will give its agreement on the geographic indications agreement. And then in September, probably we will start the scrutinizing of this agreement in the International Trade Committee, and finally the Parliament has to give a vote. So this is a positive evolution. I am not so satisfied about what is happening in the investment agreement negotiations. Last year, if you have invited me to such a debate, I would have said last November, last December, I would have said that China year for the European Union will be 2020. So we all expected really a China year. And now we have to ask, is this still a China year for the European Union? The pandemic had a huge impact on our relations, had a huge impact on global economy. The pandemic has exposed some structural shortcomings of the European Union supply chains and the economic dependencies in quite strategic sectors from China, which are too unilateral dependencies that we can tolerate them in the future. So we will have to change, we will have to do something, and the change is in way. Probably I will have the possibility to speak about this also during this discussion. But anyway, what we expect from our Chinese partners is tackling the market distorting practices, state subsidies, state-owned enterprise, heavy subsidizing in public procurement, discriminatory behavior in market access practices, and also some illegal activities. When I say illegal, I mean illegal under WTO, under the World Trade Organization rules, regarding technology transfers, and also regarding IPR protection. So we expect, we salute the declarations. The declarations, political declarations, are very important, are very good, and are they give us hope. But in parallel with declarations, we expect concrete action. So we expect the proposals of our Chinese partners. And of course, if I come back to this question, can it be 2020? Can it be the year of China in the European Union? Probably I will have to agree with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. She said yesterday in the EU-China summit that the summit is a starting point of progress. Interestingly enough, it is the same opinion that was presented recently, I think 5 or 6 days ago, by Jörg Wuttke, who is the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, who in an article, he wrote that 2020 will be, or is, the year of preparation for the big EU-China breakthrough, or the big breakthrough of the European Union regarding China relations. I just touched upon economic and trade relations very briefly. There is very much to say, but I would like to keep the discipline of this panel, so I will stop now for my first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Winkler. We'll definitely come back to you for the second round when we start the second round, and we'll have more questions for you by then. But let's for now move on to Mr. Henri Malosse, because Mr. Winkler just talked about the interest side in the overall EU-China relations. But we're also very much focused on values, because if you look at what the European Commission President or European Council President, they have a dual approach, which is to talk about interests, but also values. And after yesterday's EU-China summit, they also raised the issues about Hong Kong, about other human rights issues, including the 2 Canadians currently jailed by Chinese authorities for spying. But overall, are you satisfied with the level of attention that EU officials are paying in terms of human rights, in terms of rule of law? Or do you think they should have done more and focused on values a bit more, instead of quite a strong focus on economic policies and economic focus? What do you think?
Of course, not satisfied. Hello first to everybody. So thank you for this debate. And I think it's very timely because, as you mentioned yesterday, we had the EU-China virtual summit. Let's come to the background. Background is the COVID-19 crisis. We just go out from this crisis, we hope. And as everybody saw, it's a global crisis. It doesn't affect one country. It affects the whole world. And it shows how interdependent we are all together. But this shows also how in danger are our values and our democratic values. You say there is also with this crisis, with this health crisis, the concept of a strong man, the concept of dictatorship being more successful to fight against any kind of crisis. This is partly the today propaganda message of China. And I think we cannot accept that. The values of Europe are values of freedom, of democracy, rule of law, and who could better preserve and promote these values than the Europeans. In fact, who else? The US are from Mr. Trump or China? We have to fight for our values and to promote our values. Of course, we have trade partners, but trade is not everything. And I'm not, to be a little controversial, I'm not sharing the enthusiasm of a colleague from the European Parliament. I think that the European Union should stop to be silent or to be too discreet, because being silent and being too discreet, it's a kind of complicity. And we should remember our history. The European Union was founded after the Second World War on what happened when the Europeans in the 1930s have accepted almost everything from a strong dictatorship. I would just take one example. I could speak now about the Uyghur camps. I could speak about the organ harvesting for the Falun Gong members of this group. I could speak about Taiwan. I could speak about the incidents in the South Chinese Sea. I could speak about the Indian-Chinese border, where we have the incidents these days, today, yesterday, and a lot of casualties. But I will speak about topic with this. I think the one I know the best is the question of Tibet. For 25 years, as an example, the European Union has discreetly raised the issue to the Chinese authorities about the situation of human rights in Tibet, about, for example, the situation of the Panchen Lama, was the second highest ranking religious authority, and was disappeared and is apparently in custody. We have politely asked the Chinese, where is he? And we get never answer, never get even a photo of him. So is he dead? Is he alive? How is he? Has he been tortured? No answer. Chinese always, when you put the question, because I did it, they look at you, they smile, and they don't answer. So it's not time anymore to put questions. Now time to get answer. And how can the EU and the European leaders pretend to be the speakers, the voice, the vocal voice of rule of law, of human rights, of freedom, when we are so weak that, for example, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama visits our member states, the head of states don't dare to meet him because China could make some retaliation. So are we so weak that we are not able to meet whoever we want? We all know that the Dalai Lama is a very peaceful person. He promotes a middle way, he doesn't ask for separatism. We all know that his words are words of peace. This is why they are recognized by, I think, a very huge number of persons all over the world. He was welcome in 2016 by the European Parliament, and I really recognize that Martin Schulz had this courage, although he was hardly criticized, also inside of the European Parliament. I paid a visit to His Holiness in 2014 in Dharamsala. I was also heavily criticized, also by the European Commission, by Mrs. Ashton at that time. And in 2016, when the Dalai Lama came to Brussels, he was just discreetly met by an advisor of President Winkler, but in a way that nobody could know it, and not too much publicity. What is that? I think the Europeans should really wake up and now stand for their rights, stand for their values. You mentioned the question of trade, and I will end with that. Of course, we all make trade with all the world, but we should first think of our own interests and our values. Our own interest first means that after the COVID-19 crisis, we all know that there is a growing demand for the European population of relocalization of our activities. We saw the dependence of the European industry for Chinese pharmaceutics, the dependence for masks. We had no masks, we had no medics, everything coming from China. Can we accept that? We have, in the majority of population, I think a big number of countries in Europe now says, stop with that. We want to have our own industry. We don't want to be as dependent as we are from China and from China investment? Do we want to become like some African states, a kind of Chinese colony, where in the Human Rights Committee at the UN, when it's question about, for example, the Uyghur camp, all these countries abstain or vote against any condemnation because there is threat and pressure and corruption from China? Do you want that? I think when we speak about, for example, the value chain, when you speak about environmental criteria, which is very important, social criteria, human rights criteria, we should apply that and insist that all companies, all European companies, had due diligence, vigilance to take care that in all the supply chain, the industry in the countries we are working with respect environmental, social, and human rights values. On this condition, of course, we can make trade, but not on the condition to be, I will say, under the law of a dictatorship. We cannot accept that. We should really, we Europeans, wake up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malosse, for your insights. Our next speaker is Mr. Tim Iuliu, and our focus will be on foreign policy and in particular Belt and Road Initiative here. So Mr. Iuliu, so after the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the European Commission step up, for example, investment screening mechanism. But on the other hand, there's also some expectation from the Chinese side that since we need to rebuild the economy, maybe the BRI would be helpful to other countries. What's your take on that?
Thanks a lot for inviting me and for having me today. Yeah, I have to pick up a couple of words on Mr. Winkler and Mr. Malosse, because I would like to pick up on this question that Mr. Winkler has raised. Is 2020 a China year? And I mean, I think that 2020 is one of the China years for the European Union, really. 2019, we've seen the strategic outlook. And we've expected this year indeed to be a very different kind of China year. That I would certainly agree with several summits, with maybe a breakthrough in the investments negotiations. And that's maybe unlikely to happen. The leader summit in Leipzig is already canceled. But I think we do sort of see also with the new commission sort of a re-evaluation within the European Union of the relations with China. And that's probably to be continued next year as well. But I think it is a very interesting time, not just 2020, but including 2020. If we consider COVID-19, disinformation, the European Parliament, I think excellent resolution from last week. If we look at sort of the proposal from Mr. Borrell to have a dialogue with the US, a European American dialogue on China, if we see what's happening in Hong Kong and discussion, what does systemic rivalry mean? I think we are in a very fascinating phase within Europe of debating our relations to China in 2020. So that's why I think it is a China year for the European Union, one of several, and on a very different kind. And I think that's also why I think that the statement Mr. Malosse has made was extremely important, because it's really a time when we see these sort of realignment or renegotiation of how we relate to China. And I think it is indeed a time to also think about our values and just recognize that speaking up really helps us. And it's not a weakness. We won't suffer that much from it. If you talk to a bunch of business associations like the BDI in Germany, you see they haven't been punished for calling out on China as a systemic rival, but they've taken more serious now. The same for Business Europe. So I think sort of having a clear focus, speaking out, being very clear is actually helping Europeans. I'm not quite sure where exactly Europe will end up in its relations with China, but I think it's really a moving target here. Now to your question on BRI, and we'll be short on this because I've already used some of my time here. think we have to sort of remember or think, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, we can see it as a catch-all phrase and just say, well, all Chinese foreign affairs is the Belt and Road Initiative. But then I would need to talk for hours here. So let's define the Belt and Road Initiative as a funding framework in the field of infrastructure. And I think it is very important to remember how it came into being. After the global financial crisis, a couple of years later, I think we've seen that China has tried to export overcapacities, not necessarily the steel itself, but also the factories of steel, cement, etc. And these overcapacities had been largely a result of the enormous stimulus package of the global financial crisis. It was also an attempt, I think, to develop the market, foreign markets, in the context of economic reforms. One aspect was to internationalize Chinese technical standards to actually get access to markets in third countries. And finally, I think it was also seen as an opportunity after the global financial crisis in China, that where the West had been really struggling with the global financial crisis, where China saw the opportunity to boost its status, to project its power more actively. And that, of course, also correlated with a rise of nationalism within China. It was also a reaction to the necessity of economic reform in the country. Now, this was sort of the motivation to start. Not all of this has been successful, but I think that has been sort of largely the motivation from China. Now, the situation post-COVID-19, we also face an economic crisis, but I think it's a very different one. China is burdened with huge amounts of debt, of non-performing loans in China, and we already see a split differences within the Chinese leadership on how to deal with, on the one side, the financial situation, the difficulties of the financial system, and on the other hand, sort of the need, the requirement to have a stimulus for the economy to preserve employment, the employment situation in China. And also, I think we see that in terms of ambition and the status opportunities, it's very different. I mean, COVID has come from China, and yes, Trump has done everything to sort of help China get back into the picture here. But nonetheless, I mean, the elections are coming up in November, and I think many countries around the world are also waiting who's going to win in the November elections. So I think if we take that together, China's opportunities to sort of develop the Belt and Road further. I mean, China has admitted just, I think, a couple of days ago that around 50 to 60%, according to official figures, of BRI projects are heavily burdened with COVID-19. And if they say it's 60%, it's probably 95%. I mean, of course, some of that will reoccur. Nonetheless, I think I would be surprised if we saw the heyday of the Belt and Road Initiative anytime soon again. It will not disappear. I mean, there's clear incentives to keep it. It's also a project of Xi Jinping, but I don't think it will fly as much as it has been in the past. What does it imply for Europe? Just 2 sentences, and then I'll stop. I think we already looking back into the past, we need to see China is not a philanthropist here. I mean, China hasn't spent money on where it's most needed for Europeans. And I don't say this to blame China. I mean, this is happening around the world. All states are sort of seeking their own interests. But just compare when Italy signed the Memorandum of Understanding and sort of joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Compare, that was the same trip when the Chinese leaders not just came to Italy, but also to France. And Italy just got a fraction of the investments that France got, simply because China had a stronger interest in economic assets from France. And the same applies if you look at Germany, not willing to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Sweden, the only European country who has not been willing to even participate in the last Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, receives quite a number of investments. It's almost at its highest level in history. So maybe we need to sort of think again, how important really is the Belt and Road Initiative here? Our expectations, whatever hopes for investments from China related to the Belt and Road Initiative might be a bit overestimated and might be even more than in the past disappointed. And challenges, I think, remain, but that's more related to China's broader economic and foreign affairs. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, personally, I don't see this flying in the coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Rühling. And now we turn to our last speaker, Mr. Richard Ghiasy, and we'll talk a bit about military situation in China and the Asia-Pacific region. And we know that Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, recently made a gaffe when he seemed to be saying that China is not really playing a role that would threaten world peace. Of course, he later on clarified that he was simply repeating the Chinese official stance. But some commentators are also saying that this probably explains the sort of European view to Chinese military threat, which is probably more confined to the Asia-Pacific region, in which, of course, America is a player, which indirectly means that Europe is away from it. I mean, give us an overall sense of the military situation in Asia and how you usually explain to European people here.
Okay, well, look, Stuart, China's military ambitions are immense. There should be no doubt about that. Yet these ambitions are commensurate with the geographic and demographic reality of the country. Let me explain. China has the longest land border in the world, the most neighbors, 14 of any country in the world, the largest population, and one of the least blessed maritime environments you can imagine. In military capacity and projection power, China is still far behind the US, partially behind Russia, and in terms of military technology, behind Japan, Israel, and select European powers too. Now, because China can still not match the military supremacy of the US, its prime competitor, China will continue to develop military capacity and aim to project power in non-conventional warfare, such as cyber, and conventional warfare in every region that it deems strategic. Now, the most strategic regions to China are its adjacent regions: Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and East Asia, and the possible threats that emanate from these regions. But still more so, China will focus on its most vulnerable flank. That's the maritime domain and perceived threats from mostly the US Navy. Now, as a historically and predominantly continental power, China has no military threat to speak of from land by either the US, Russia, India, or Europe. It is therefore very driven to develop its blue water navy. And China will focus, as you mentioned, Stuart, very much on the Western Pacific in order to immobilize maritime threats. And it will focus also on the Indian Ocean to secure its supply lines: energy, goods, food, non-food. It will not focus on the Atlantic for now. Now, the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific are distant places to Europe. But Europe does have considerable economic and security interests in these far-flung regions and will need to make sure that it has the naval power to protect these. Now, to China's neighbors, its immediate neighbors and its extended neighbors, China's military ambitions can be and generally are perceived as a threat. We need to take two factors into consideration, though. One is, historically, China has typically been a defensive civilization. Now, while historical conduct is no guarantee for future conduct, this defensive mindset is quite ingrained in the Chinese policy psyche. I absolutely agree that during Mao, there was a strong deviation from this mindset. But I would say that today, China is doing anything in its power to be capable to defend itself and its interest militarily, no doubt. And two, great powers, you can label China as a great power now for sure, always attempt to dominate their region. If you look at the US, for instance, it got rid of every European power in its region in the mid and late 19th century. even waged war with Spain in the final years of that century to take control of the Caribbean. So China is no exception to the great power role. But back to the EU, Europe, I would say that much more so currently than the threat of China's military aspirations, much more pressing are by far the economic and technological competition with China. In addition to non-conventional warfare, such as cyber and diplomacy. Now, this said, I do support more autonomous European military capacity. I think that this domain is far too strategic to leave to other actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghiasy. And we now move back to our first speaker, Mr. Winkler, MEP. And we just talked about the investment agreement in the first round. So in the second round, why don't we talk a bit about the overall trading relationship between EU and China? I think one particular problem that for a lot of European countries that they've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic is the over-reliance of supply, especially of vital drugs or PPEs from particular countries. How do you propose European countries diversify their supply in the future? And is it possible at all, given that so much of the supply is actually based in China or a very few number of countries, is it possible at all to diversify the supply?
Thank you for this second question. Very, very valuable and very diverse remarks from the panelists and from the speakers. Let me make an introduction also to reflect a little bit on what has been said. So first of all, about our overall relation with China. I think that the communication of the Commission last year, which mentioned the 4 types of engagement of the European Union with China, is a very valuable one. Anyway, I can speak on behalf of the EPP. I am a member of the European People's Party in the European Parliament. And I can speak on behalf of EPP when we support this approach. So it's very clear that China and EU are cooperation partners. We have a large institutional framework of cooperation in very diverse domains. I will not read them out. Then, of course, we are negotiation partners. And as you very well said, we are negotiating an investment agreement, but we are negotiating also lots of issues, for example, modernizing the WTO. And I'm very satisfied that China seems to be a genuine partner in modernizing the WTO and in generally speaking, modernizing the whole global multilateral rules-based system. We have a huge number of institutions, global institutions, and we have to be able to rely on them in future too. Because when you dissent, when you have an argument, when you have a problem, you have to rely on rules. There is no other possibility to conflict resolution than to rely on a rules-based system. Then, of course, we are competitors, and it's very clear that the EU and China are competitors. Again, there is a huge array of domains, starting from trade, investment in third countries, artificial intelligence, new technologies, and you name it, domains in which we are clearly in competition. But this competition has to be a fair one. There's no problem with competition, but it has to be a fair competition. So we need the famous level playing field that we are speaking so much about in our investment and trade relations. And finally, indeed, as our speakers have highlighted some of the issues, we are rivals, and this is something to acknowledge. The EU and China are systemic rivals, first of all, regarding our values. And here I come to Mr. Henri Malosse and his observations. Yes, of course, the European Union is a value-based association. We are, of course, interest-based association also, but we base our policies on values. And this is a very important discussion. And the perennial discussion in the European Parliament. We should never forget our values while we are in cooperation, in negotiation, in competition, or even in rivalry with our Chinese partners. So this is a very complex relation that we are speaking about. So it's not about trade versus values. It's not about choosing. Either we choose our democratic values or our global or our universal values. Either we choose to build up trade. No, it's not a choice that we have to make. We never abandon our values. Then coming to the issue of dependency and the concrete questions. As I have said before in my first intervention, the global pandemic has highlighted our exaggerated dependency. Of course, dependency is equal to vulnerability. And we could see it in March, we could see it in April, that we are too dependent. This is not to say that we did not have very valuable moments of cooperation. We discussed China, yes? So many European politicians, many heads or leaders of European institutions have formulated thanks to the cooperation with China in tackling the pandemic. Of course, probably an equal number of European representatives have voiced concerns about certain aspects of the pandemic intervention in China and globally, and the role of China in this whole issue. So we have a controversy here too. The first answer to the issue of dependency is a new concept which was coined out by our Trade Commissioner, Mr. Phil Hogan, whom I, by the way, highly appreciate. He is a very experienced politician, and he was also before, as you know, Commissioner for Agriculture, and in this capacity has followed all the evolutions in our trade relations with all the global partners, because for the European Union, trade and agriculture go hand in hand. So the answer to our dependency problem is the new concept of open strategic autonomy. So do we want, or can we become autonomous from all point of view? I think no. That is clearly the answer. We cannot, and we do not want to be autonomous, because one of the important issues in which the European Union is indeed a global leader, it is the open and free trade. Once again, trade has not only to be open and free, it has also to be fair, but trade is a very important instrument also for spreading, disseminating values. And we know very well that when we discuss about the new generation of trade agreements, we discuss about trade and social and sustainable development issues, the TSD chapters in our new agreements. When we discuss about the enforceability of those trade and sustainable development clauses, then we are in at the chapter of disseminating European values. What does, in this case, open strategic autonomy mean? I'm not sure we know already, because strategic. Which are the strategic sectors for the European Union industry and economy overall? I'm sure that if we ask, we have 31 participants to this panel. If we ask the 31 participants, each one of them, please name the strategic sectors for the European Union, we will have quite diverse answers. Of course, energy is strategic. Of course, agriculture is, and food security is strategic for any region in the world. But we can make a long list. So we have to renegotiate, to rediscuss internally in the European Union, which are the industrial sectors that we want to maintain. Do we have to maintain steel and aluminium? Just steel, because it's not only economic importance, but it's also symbolic, because steel is on what we have built our European Union. It was the the Union for Steel and Coal, first of all, and then we have developed the European Union of today. Health, is it a strategic sector? Of course. New technologies, are they strategic? The cybersecurity, is it strategic? So we have to have this discussion in the European Union, and this discussion already has a frame, because last week DigiTrade and Commissioner Phil Hogan have announced the revision of the EU trade policy. This revision comes after 5 years, because our last policy paper was published in 2015, in the autumn of 2015, under Commissioner Cecilia Malmström. It was the Trade for All document. Now, after 5 years, we have a new situation. We have this pandemic. Unfortunately, the pandemic obviously has not ended. We are waiting the consequences. We still don't have a vaccine. So, of course, we did not solve the problem. So we need this revision of our trade policy. Stakeholders can respond until mid-September to the open dialogue of the DigiTrade of the European Commission. And this dialogue, this European debate, will be a crucial debate in responding. Then again, what we are sure that we need, of course, we need a new trade defense instrument system. The TDIs are quite outdated in the European Union's case. So we have to, do we need to become protectionist? No, but we have to protect, we have to support without being protectionist. And when can we find out that we become protectionist? Of course, when we break WTO rules. So that's why I said also before, WTO and the international rules-based system is crucial. So we need a revamping of the WTO. We need a revamping of our toolbox for the European trade defense instruments, state subsidies instrument, foreign direct investment screening instrument. And all those will be parts of our response to our dependence problem and lack of resilience problem. Of course, we have different responses also. Just think about the European Union's bilateral trade agreements. We have 76 FTAs. We are negotiating now with Australia and New Zealand, very valuable and absolutely like-minded democratic partners. But we had a huge success recently. We closed the first FTA, free trade agreement, with a developing country with a different system as the European Union, namely Vietnam. So if we can agree with Vietnam, surely we can agree with China also. Do we have to depend only on China? Absolutely not. Do we need diversification? Absolutely yes. Can we be autonomous, like isolationist? Absolutely not. Do we need free trade and do we promote free trade? Yes, we promote open and free trade, but fairness also. So we need fair trade and we need level playing field, so that reciprocity can be the rule and not the exception. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Winkler. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions directed to you in the Q&A session, so I hope you can stay with us and join that session as well. So we now move back to Mr. Malosse, and we were talking about human rights just a while ago, and of course, one of the biggest issues that the EU was talking with China about yesterday was the situation in Hong Kong and the national security legislation. And Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, talked about very negative consequences if China pushed ahead with the law. But so far, there's no indication that Europe is going to be as tough as Washington or London in considering sanctions, for example, Magnitsky Act, and so on and so forth. Do you think the European Union could do more in this regard?
As I say, hello, my microphone was not on. As I said previously, the European Union could do, of course, more. What is very impressive is to see that during this COVID-19 and now post-COVID, COVID which came from Wuhan, China, as you know, with obscure routes or reasons, we still have to be found. That's why I support the idea of international investigation to know exactly what happens. But during this period, the Chinese regime, because I made a distinction between the Chinese regime and China and the Chinese people. Chinese people have not to blame, it's the dictatorship who can be blamed. What happened with the national security law was adopted by the Chinese, by the Communist Assembly, Parliament, can't say, because there is no free election in China, as everybody knows. So it's just people who are nominated by the Communist Party who are sitting there. What happens is that in this law, you have at least 3 articles who are very dangerous. One to establish, in fact, justice and police Chinese, Communist China authorities in Hong Kong itself. And one is to prevent or even punish anyone in Hong Kong who could be suspected of anti-China activities. So that means that could be all the Democrats. The question is, for me, and I think it may be interesting for our audience, why China is doing that? Why China used, in fact, this COVID time, not just to threat and to aggress Hong Kong, but also to threat and aggress India and the Indian border, to take some islands from Vietnam in the South Chinese Sea, in the Parcels Island, to threat Taiwan again, to threat Japan. Is it a sign that China is preparing, is accelerating the recovery of Hong Kong, which is foreseen for 2047? I'm not so sure. I think, in fact, that what's happened in China today reminds me what happened also in the, I would say, 70s in the Soviet Union. I think the Chinese leadership, as all dictatorship, he's scared by what could happen, and but the democratic spirit, which is so strong in Hong Kong, and I can just congratulate you, you're from Hong Kong, and all people from Hong Kong, this democratic spirit could spread up all over China. When you see all the repression in the Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, it's recent, in the recent 10 years mainly, which had started at this scale. But the repression in Tibet is growing. The incidents at all borders. You can see that this regime is under pressure. We have commemorated some days ago the Tiananmen Square events, and all dictatorship, their only way is to try to survive and to try to protect them from their own people that they sent to prison, because the victims of this regime are the Chinese themselves. So I think for these particular reasons, because I think that it's not a symbol of strength, it's a symbol of weakness, all these measures. Why China with 1.4 billion of inhabitants could be threatened by the small Hong Kong with some 3-4 million inhabitants. The only answer for me is that they don't want the democratic spirit to become now inspiration for the Chinese youth, from the Chinese people. And this is why, and I come back to the previous discussion, why it's so important that the European Union stay vocal. Of course, trade sometimes is useful, but as when Mr. Winkler was telling that trade can bring, it's a way to promote our values, I will object concerning China. In which extent the trade we did with China for the last 20 years, which increased drastically, and made any positive change in the respect of environmental, social, and human rights values in China. I see the opposite. But as I say, any dictatorship has one day an end. all the long life dictator president like Mr. Xi Jinping, who has declared himself as a long life president. We have so many experience in the history that it comes to an end much sooner than they themselves expect. So China, yes, I will not say that China is a partner for us. Chinese people, yes, but China's dictatorship regime, of course not. It's a competitor, it's a rival, and it's a threat for our own values in our own country. We saw some European southern countries who, for example, have abstained in the Human Rights Committee of the UN to condemn China because of the Chinese investment in their country, because China bought ports, built roads, and this is a threat for our value and for our democracy. And we have in trade, coming back to trade, we have to fight for our own interest. Is it our interest to have seen our steel and coal industry, aluminum industry, as was mentioned by Mr. Winkler, but also textile industry, leather industry. We have millions of jobs, a health industry to be dismantled. I think it's not our interest. We have to fight much more for our interest in trade and to promote much more vocally our values. Should be 2020 the year of China, the year of Young China. I would like to see 2020 as the year of the Chinese people oppressed by the regime, the year of nations occupied by China, like Tibetans and Uyghur, the threat of a free democratic country like Taiwan, oppressed and threatened by China. This will make a sense and will make really a difference for a real democratic value and democratic Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malosse. We now turn back to Mr. Rühling, and maybe we can spend the next 4 to 5 minutes talking about 5G, because last year there was, of course, very intense discussion within the EU about 5G suppliers from Huawei Technologies, in particular, a Chinese company that is alleged to have strong ties with the Communist Party, a claim that the company itself denied. And can you tell us what is your expectation in the next year or so about the sort of strategies, the sort of policies that European governments might undertake in relation to 5G policy? We've seen some European governments, in principle, agreeing, Huawei and every operator to operate in their respective countries. But also, if you look at some other countries, the UK, for example, trying to phase out Huawei by a certain time frame. Do you see the sort of post-COVID-19 geopolitical situation possibly being a hurdle to Huawei's development in Europe?
Thanks. So I have 45 minutes to respond. That's excellent. No. Yeah, well, to answer your question in one sentence, I think, yes, there will be a hurdle in the post-COVID-19 world for Huawei. I think we can see that. We can see the impact of COVID-19 on Huawei. I think the clearest probably in the United Kingdom, where we have signs that Canada will also turn away from Huawei. We have this initiative from the UK to have the leading economies, the G7, turning away as a group from Huawei, from Chinese technology, mainly from Huawei. Interesting, I think, is to sort of recall what this debate is all about. I mean, we have been very much focusing in the public debate on cybersecurity issues related to 5G. And I think there have been mainly two concerns being raised. One, espionage, and the other sabotage. Espionage, I think, is pretty straightforward. The question here is whether the inclusion of Huawei technologies provides a better opportunity for Chinese authorities to spy on Europeans. On sabotage, I think that might not be as self-explanatory. Here, the fear is that if we use Huawei technology, it would be easy for China to take out our whole 5G networks. We call it a kill switch. so they could switch off our 5G network. And if you imagine that a future 5G network might be the one on which self-driving cars are running, that connects your pacemaker to the hospital a couple of kilometers away, so monitoring your heartbeats all the time. If you consider it is sort of important to the security of your home and smart homes, if you consider it is important to machine communication and vital for industrial production, then you can imagine how important sort of, or how threatening this kill switch scenario is, because it could essentially take out societies and economies in the future. The challenge here is, or the absurd aspect here is that if you talk to technicians, to engineers, to hackers, they say, well, China has the capacity of espionage and sabotage, and whether you take out Huawei or not doesn't make a huge difference. I mean, it's a serious issue, and we could debate here the technical details on how to at least increase the cost of espionage and sabotage for China. But the real issue here is taking out Huawei from the network might simply not be the solution. But there's another issue related to the question of how we deal with Huawei, and that is the technology dependencies and its geopolitics. So the main concern here is that if Huawei is a company that is not just seeking profit, but that is essentially controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, that our dependencies on Huawei could lead to a situation where China is asking for political concessions, or to a stage where we as Europeans feel that we can't speak up freely anymore, because we fear that China could refuse, or Huawei through China could refuse to maintain our 5G networks, or to contribute to the further build out. And I think this is sort of the real challenge, because that I think is a real issue. And if you look at one of my recent publications, you can also see that I think a question whether Huawei is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party might not be, we might not be able to verify that 100%. We do see sort of mechanisms how the Chinese Communist Party is able to do so. And that I think in itself should be worrisome to us. Now, what does that, the tech dependencies or over dependencies, that is sort of the real issue if we sort of rely too much on an actor that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So, and then of course, these broader questions come into the picture again that Mr. Winkler particularly has been referring to. The question, how independent do we want to be? Do we want to go with the US? We've been talking about the Sinatra doctrine in the last few weeks with Mr. Borrell and The Economist writing about it, saying, so Europe wants to do it my way. They don't want to go with the US or China, but want to do it a European way. Question is, of course, sort of how to achieve that and what is the European way. And I think here Mr. Winkler has pointed to a couple of issues. Before I get back to that, let me just say, because your question was also related to what to expect in the narrow field of 5G in the coming years. I think the 5G toolbox that the European Union, the NIS Cooperation Group, has put forward earlier this year, I think it has been very often interpreted as a compromise. I don't think it's a compromise at all. I think it very much prescribes a roadmap to reduce, if not to fully abandon Huawei technology. So I think the experts seem to have suggested a way, the experts from the member states and the Commission seem to have sort of put forward a framework how member states can reduce their dependencies. And I think we do see a number of member states taking steps into that direction. Consider MOUs that Poland or Romania have concluded with the United States. See the debate in Germany that's rather moving away from Huawei. France, Italy have legislation in place that makes it at least very easy for them to abandon Huawei. Same goes for Sweden. Denmark debating, and now even from Hungary, that has always insisted it will stick to Huawei, we have seen some signs from the Hungarian government to distance itself. So I'm not saying that Hungary will also fall into that camp, but if even Hungary is debating that, I feel that Huawei might be on the track out of Europe, or at least for a very, very much reduced market share in Europe. Will all the European Union member states adopt the same policies? Very unlikely, I think. I still sort of also count that Huawei will be able to stay within Hungary, probably also in Portugal, maybe a couple of other states. But I see a trend of more and more, and particularly central, like in the center of Europe, countries moving sort of away from Huawei, actually for different reasons, I think. But the prospects for Huawei in Europe, I think, are not very good at the moment. Now, 1 second, I know I've already spoken quite long, but a sentence relating sort of back to the broader picture, because Mr. Winkler has referred to the strategic outlook put forward by the European External Action Service last year. And he has said that the European People's Party is supporting sort of this tripartite framework, being partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And I think probably all or most of us agree that this has really been a step forward. I think the real issue now is sort of how to fill that tripartite framework with life. What does it mean? Does it mean, and I think there's a continuum, but on one spectrum, there's this opportunity to say, well, on Monday, we talk about climate change, and then we are partners. On Wednesday, we have discussions about trade, and then we are competitors. And on Friday, we talk about Hong Kong or about cybersecurity or something, and then we are rivals. This is, I think, one way forward. Another is to say, well, it actually has an impact on Friday, on Monday, what we're going to speak about on Friday. We can be a partner in the same sense if we are a systemic rival on other issues. And I feel, and that of course requires more strategic thinking, more thinking in terms of package deals, how to relate issues to one another. I think there's no doubt that we have to cooperate with China on a couple of issues. The question is, do we sort of, is this tripartite identity helping us to not see it as three pillars that are completely separate from each other, or can we link also the topics? And I mean, you can hear my preference. I think talking about climate change and trade and all those issues, we can't actually forget that we have fundamental differences on a number of issues. And here I think Mr. Malosse has elaborated on a number of them, and there are more to it. And cyber security issues are also part of it. And I think that is sort of the crucial question. How can we develop a partnership on the one hand, but at the very same time, not forget about the issues that we are in a systemic rivalry with China, and how can we actually strategically leverage what we have, which is not all too much. We shouldn't also overemphasize European strength, but we should also not forget that Europe is one of the central players in world affairs, particularly if we stick together.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rühling. And I think you just touched upon some very interesting questions. And I'm pretty sure we'll have a lot of questions for you later on as well. So last but not least, we'll go back to Richard Ghiasy. And maybe you can give us a sense of the future, the forward-looking part of EU-China relations. I mean, Tim just talked about the tripartite categorization that the EU has for China. Borrell, the HRVP, was also trying to explain the systemic rival part, and then he was saying something about EU is not really trying to create a systematic rivalry. So that also caused a lot of confusion among policymakers. So give us a sense from your perspective, how the EU-China relations in future would look like, and is it a note of positivism? Is it a note of rivalry? How do you interpret this?
Sure. Well, look, relations will become much more selective between the EU and China. And I would say even in general among major and great powers. Now, what do I mean by this? Technological, economic, and security competition, and these three are all interlinked, between China and the EU have and will continue to intensify, with or without an agreement on investment. There should be no doubt about this. The EU will seek more autonomy. China already has sought that for many decades, but may even increase it in response to an EU shifting stance. In some cases, the EU, Japan, the US, and India may even cooperate and hedge against China in certain sectors. Now, this shift is driven by two factors. The first factor is over who calls the shots. In other words, who sets the standards in the fourth industrial revolution. Traditionally, the power that has led an industrial revolution has led, or at least co-led, the world. Britain led the first industrial revolution, Europe and the US the second, US, Europe, and to a smaller degree, Japan the third. But this unfolding fourth industrial revolution, driven by the digitalization of the world, is likely to be co-led by the US and China. The EU too, if the EU puts enough strategic effort into it. Now, we live in an era where neither China, the US, nor the EU wants to go to armed conflict with one another. Therefore, competition proceeds mainly through the economy and directly tied to that technology. The frenzy around China's 5G telecom technology lead is a prime example of competition over who sets the standards in this digital transition. So the EU will have an increasingly bipolar relationship with China that is simultaneously cooperative and simultaneously rivalrous, as the other three panelists have mentioned. Now, obviously, this will reflect in diplomatic relations. I would say that these mostly remain courteous, but they will reflect naturally this growing bipolarity and will likely become franker. But mind you, China has already had a simultaneously cooperative and simultaneously rivalrous relationship with the EU for decades. Now, the second factor is the pandemic. Let me first state the pandemic is not a historic turning point, nor will it reverse the trend of globalization. It has, however, indeed been a wake-up call for the EU. It was mentioned before. And it has catalyzed a number of mostly pre-existing trends. The pandemic has exposed, among other things, the strategic need for indigenous EU supply chains of, among other things, pharmaceutical and medical supplies. For example, EU dependence on China for many medical supplies is strategically just sheer folly. So inevitably, between the EU and China, trade and investment will open up for less strategic industries, yet become more select, much more protective for strategic sectors. And shared with by some of the panelists, the question is about defining those. But mind you, a more selective stance in trade and investment is not single-handedly brought about by this pandemic. It was already the case when China, led by Huawei, introduced 5G. Now, in sum, the relationship in the future will continue with mutual interest. It will continue with mutual engagement. It will definitely not get as ugly as the Sino-US relationship, but it will become more bipolar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ghiasy. And we now open the floor to the participants if they have a question for our participants. And so in the meantime, I actually got a couple of questions myself, and one to Mr. Winkler and one to Mr. Ghiasy. And my question to Mr. Winkler is, what happens if there's no investment agreement by the end of this year, which is the self-imposed deadline? What would you say, the European Commission should do? Should there be more diversification? Should there be more investment screening? Or should the talks keep going on until one day you can persuade the Chinese government to make the changes you want? And my second question to Mr. Ghiasy is, Mr. Borrell's full title is actually High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. In the latter half of his title, do you think there's any element of China, of Asia, that might be instilled in his role, or do you think the EU's security policy is basically totally away from Asia, totally away from China? What would be your take on this? So maybe Mr. Winkler can start with the first question.
Thank you very much. Well, this year, to conclude the investment agreement, I wouldn't say this is a deadline. This is a political ambition. Nobody can and nobody will put deadlines to the negotiation process of the European Commission. It's DG Trade negotiators that are negotiating. But you know the very complicated process of the European Union. So the member states, the Council is giving the mandate. The European Parliament is monitoring the negotiation process itself, even if it's not at the negotiating table, and the Commission does the negotiations. We have the very clear standpoint of the European Parliament, which was formulated over and over again. No speed over quality. So if we have our objectives fulfilled, if we can reach the common ground, if we can have an agreement which is good for our companies, for European companies, for European jobs, and finally for European people, then we will have an agreement. And it is very clear. That's why I emphasized the new competencies of the European Parliament, and especially of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee. We have the right to say no, and we will use this. We have shown in the past, after 2019, after the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has shown very clearly that this is not only a theoretical possibility, but it is an active possibility. If we don't feel like we are satisfied, if we don't feel like the agreement serves the interests, the best interest of European companies, of European people, of European job, of European values, then this agreement or any agreement will not have the green light from the European Parliament. So, of course, this would be, once again, not a deadline, 2020, but a political ambition. It would be a good sign because, as has been highlighted by all the speakers, we have such a vast array of bilateral issues to solve. We have so many problems on the table. We have so many differences in our views, in our values, in our objectives, in our future vision, that any agreement would serve the progress. Any agreement is good. And by the way, about the trade's role in disseminating European values. Probably we will not change the regime in China using a trade agreement or an investment agreement, but probably this isn't even our means. We do not want something like this. What we want is to maintain the dialogue channels open, to maintain the cooperation, and in the four issues of negotiation, cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry, of course, we would prefer, I speak for myself, I speak for the politicians in the International Trade Committee, but I think I speak for many of the people, and I speak for companies also largely, that we would prefer the open channels of communication. We would prefer to have each year a small progress, or we would prefer even to have years with huge progress. I hope that this political objective can be fulfilled, but it will become a reality only if our expectations are met. If not, then we will continue the negotiation. We will enter into 2021. In the meantime, we will have our new trade policy document probably at the end of this year. And of course, that accents in the European Parliament. You see, 10 years ago, not many people talked about trade and sustainable development. Not many people talked about environmental clauses. Not many people talked about social clauses. And today, everybody is being very attentive of these issues. So Things are changing. Europe is changing as the world is changing, of course. We need trade, but we need that the beneficial effects of trade have to come in forefront. So if we don't conclude until December, then in January we will continue.
Thank you. And Mr. Ghiasy, maybe you can also respond to my second question before we move on to some questions that we are already seeing on the chat box.
Sure. Well, Mr. Borrell's security agenda should include, and I'm sure it does include, Asia for quite a number of reasons. Asia on aggregate has the largest population. Asia contributes on aggregate most to the growth of world GDP. The markets in Asia, from ASEAN to South Asia to China, are all highly strategic to the European private sector and their interests. But also the EU has supply lines that reach as far as East Asia, Japan, South Korea, that bypass China. Energy interests from Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. But also, if you look at the power balance in the Atlantic is marginally shifting, I would say, very marginally in favor of Europe, the EU at the moment now with what's going on in DC. But in Asia, the power balance is shifting quite dramatically. Mostly, but not exclusively, brought about by China's reemergence and China's aspirations. Now, the EU has interest there, the reasons I mentioned, trade supply lines, but also in a number of cases, territorial interests in the Indo-Pacific, England, for instance, France as well, and wants to make sure that there is dialogue, that there is stability, that there is predictability as this power balance shifts. So absolutely, the EU's own security, the EU's future security is narrowly tied to that of Asians.
Thank you, Mr. Ghiasy. And I've seen a couple of questions from Kasia Zalichowska. So the second one is actually very specific on the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think maybe Tim could help us here. And so the question is, what about the future synergies between BRI projects and EU-China connectivity platform? Could that give us a much needed boost?
I don't know. It really depends on how we sort of see that. I mean, there are synergies, and I would never oppose cooperating with China on the connectivity platform and try to relate the connectivity platform to the BRI. The question sort of is what kind of projects, what kind of conditions under which these BRI projects are we talking about here? I think from the European perspective, it is very clear that a number of rules have been met, and Mr. Winkler has been referring to this need before in a different context very, very clearly. So if BRI projects comply to a number of rules regarding transparency, regarding procurement, etc., then why not? I mean, of course, there would be no reason to not cooperate. I'm the last one to advocate that. At the same time, if you look at the share of Chinese contractors getting BRI projects and compared to local contractors, then the share is not very encouraging. Most of the Chinese funds for those projects go to Chinese companies. That is not a basis for cooperation. So it very much depends on how a BRI project develop, how transparent and open they are, how much they comply to international rules. I see some movement here, China being a bit more open, but I feel it's too early to very optimistic here and embrace that. So potentially, yes.
Thank you. And I'll take a question from another participant before, if we have time, to go back to Ghiasy. And so I got a question from Greg Stack here. His second question is specifically addressed to Mr. Rühling and Mr. Winkler. And maybe I can start with that one because it's more targeted. And so the question is, do you think that we will see a move away from a fragmented approach to EU-China relations outlined in the Strategic Outlook 2019 to a more holistic approach connecting different issues, for example, the Parliament resolution on human rights? And are we going to see a shift here? So would you, maybe Tim could respond to that first?
Well, on the division between the Parliament and other EU institutions, I think this is a clear division of labor for a long time, and I think it will stay that way. The European Parliament has, in its resolutions over the years, always been more principled, more insisting on European values in the relations with China. That is not a surprise, I think, because the competences in foreign policy for the European Parliament are limited. It is the Council, so the member states, and it's the Commission who needs to actually implement EU foreign policy as such. So I think here this division of labor will continue, I think. And I would also argue that we have had sort of good experiences with that. European Parliament has, I think, very successfully played the role of reminding other EU institutions of the values. And if I can't help it but credit the European Parliament to a significant extent to these at least clearer words from von der Leyen and Michel yesterday on Hong Kong. I'm not saying that they should have not gone any further. Greg knows I would have loved them to go further, but I think the division of labor, I think, is built into the institutions and it has worked well. Is Europe as such going to be driving a more united policy? I hope so. I'm at best cautiously optimistic. I don't know. I maybe on a number of issues, COVID-19 has brought us a bit together. I'm not sure. That could easily blow up again. I'm not that optimistic here. And also, if I may add just one more thought, I mean, I have probably made it pretty clear before that I would like to see a strategic linkage between the partner, competitor, and rival aspect. But what I don't want to say here is, of course, that we can't cooperate with China. So obviously these three roles continue, and the way forward cannot be that we go to China and say, well, we're not going to cooperate with you on climate change anymore unless you do something on Hong Kong. So it's really a balancing. It is, and I don't have sort of the grand solution to offer here, how to sort of balance between the need to cooperate, even though we disagree on a number of issues, but at the very same time also say, well, we can't just cooperate on some aspects, and they say, okay, then we have to accept that we have different viewpoints in others. So it's really a fine balancing act, and I think what is really necessary within Europe, and that is maybe the only hope I can give, that maybe we could start such a debate on how to actually fill these three different roles with life, how to connect them, and also think a bit about criteria, how to find priorities in our policies towards China. And I think there could be much more to do, and maybe there will be a bit way forward, a unitary European China policy. I hope so.
Thank you. And Mr. Winkler, would you also like to add a few words on Greg's question?
Yes, just to try to be very brief, because this is a good title for the new conference that we could start after the lunch break. So let me just ask you, is Europe speaking in one voice regarding Russia or Ukraine or Turkey? Obviously not. So how come it could so easily speak on one voice in relation with China? It cannot, at least it cannot for the moment. We had a very rare, we have, because it's still in the present time, we have a very rare one voice moment in relation to the United Kingdom in the Brexit issue. But that's a different kind of geopolitical context. So we have fragmentation in relation with China. We have sectorial fragmentation. We even have geographical fragmentation inside the European Union, the 16 or 17+1 issue and many others. So this is a situation. We have to make the maximum out of it. We have to build brick by brick. We have to build, as the Great Wall was built some hundreds of years ago. We have to build this unique or united European voice towards China. It is not easy. It has to be based on values and on interest. Probably it's much easier to unite values because there is a broader agreement on values at European Union level than it is at the agreement on interest. But we can build this in a cooperative way. What I think is crucial, that we have to continue the dialogue. What is crucial is also to get to know each other better, and this is quite a difficult task because there are so many realities about China that we don't know, but also there are issues about Europe, about the member states that our Chinese partners maybe do not understand very clearly and very exactly. And in this whole time, the world is changing rapidly around us. We have the COVID crisis today, but we will have another crisis tomorrow. That's sure. I don't know which one, but it's sure that different types of crises will come in following years. So we have to build up resilience. Resilience is linked a little bit with the unity of the European Union. And now after the Brexit, after the COVID crisis, you know, we have this conference on the future of Europe, which should have been started already in May this year. It was the COVID which changed the plans, but the conference on the future of Europe will continue, and it will bring also, together with other forms of dialogue, it will bring more clarity. So I'm optimistic also. I don't think it will happen tomorrow, but I think that the direction is towards more European cohesion towards China. And I will have to say hello now. Excuse me, I will have to go because at 1 o'clock I have a different engagement. But it was a pleasure discussing with you, and I have to tell you I learned a lot from this discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your participation, Mr. Winkler. So we still have 20 or so minutes to go. And so I understand that Mr. Malosse would like to reflect on some of the questions that we've already raised. Mr. Malosse, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I think this was a very interesting debate. And I would just to raise two issues which I think we could reflect in a work of Vocal Europe or in our work. The first is that it's mainly from Mr. Winkler from the Parliament, but he left now. But we don't, from the COVID-19 crisis, that we are doing business as usual, as we don't have with the health sectors, but we don't see that there is a big movement among the European population for relocalization.
Mr. Malosse, I'm afraid we might have lost your connection.
And, you should hear what Mr. Macron says. Merkel. Yes, is it okay now?
Can you try again?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think this internet was not stable. No, I just have briefly two concerns. The first is that listening to the debate and listening to Mr. Winkler particularly, we can fear that we are doing business as usual. but the COVID crisis didn't exist. And we hear from this COVID crisis, we learn a lot about our too strong dependence from China in a lot of sectors, including in our health, mask, medicament, and so on, and the threat coming also from China. We hear that there is a growing concern, not just about population, but also against European leaders. Listen to what Mr. Macron says during the crisis and other leaders about the questioning of a trade policy of the EU, the too much dependence, the too much, as Mr. Winkler says, the trade didn't make any progress in human rights. If you see the situation of not just of China, look at Pakistan with SPG and with the deterioration situation of human rights. My second question, my second concern is I was very interested by the demonstration of Team Rühling, about this necessity of taking the China relation as a whole, not to divide. It's easy to divide environmental issues and then human rights issues. We live in a global world. We see the health situation very important, and to show also, and I was a little disappointed not to hear that from a parliament member, any compassion for all the victims of the communist regimes. Hundreds of people in Hong Kong have been put to jail because they are Democrats. Millions of Uyghurs have been put in camp for decades. This incident at the Indian border where Indian soldiers had been killed. We saw what happened in the South China Sea. So where is the solidarity? Where is the act? As there is a Tibetan act of a US Congress, as there is Uyghur Act was voted last week by the US Congress, and I would say the question of Mr. Easy I saw was also, should we have, it's not for me the question, but you should follow or not follow the US way. It's a question to be clear on what we want. One trade for the last decades, the European Union is in deficit from this region. It's not the European Union, it's mainly China. Should we continue on this way and lose millions of jobs where our population doesn't accept this behavior, this kind of trade? No. Should we continue to be not vocal on question of human rights and not show compassion, not receive the high personality of Tibet like His Holiness, or to receive him discreetly, not to provoke China? No. If it's the US way, why not?
Mr. Malosse, I'm afraid the connection is not very well again.
Yes.
Would you like to try to reconnect, and then maybe we can go back to you afterwards? And for the time being, we have another question from Mr. Tudor Fabian, and his question is addressed to either Tim or Richard, depending on who's interested to comment on it. And so his question is, when the European Union's member states lack a clear common threat assessment, how can one come up with a coherent policy on tackling wedge strategies of divide and rule by coercive actors in creating economic or technological dependencies to be exploited for political aims? So Richard, would you like to comment on it in a few words, and then we can move on to Tim if he has something to add?
Sure. Well, that's a very good question indeed by Tudor. Well, the short answer is limit economic dependence on China and limit technological dependence on China. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But in terms of economic dependence, look, China is a market of 1.3, closer to 1.4 now billion, and growing more affluent by the day. It is an extremely interesting market, but it's not the only market. India, although in a different stage of development, 1.3 billion. Indonesia, give or take 200 million. Mexico, Brazil, Bangladesh, the various countries in Africa. So one way to go about it is simply by both trying to support, but mostly trying to diversify European investment and trade interests, different markets throughout the world. Now, tech dependence, I would say, is not that strong yet. It may grow strong depending on how strongly and effectively the EU manages to sustain, to boost its own tech sector. But currently, it's mostly Chinese consumer goods, cellular, IT, a few other domains. But as long as the EU manages to sustain its own lead, that threat, that hybrid threat, is going to be there, but it's going to be more minimal. Now, obviously, the EU also needs to set up a clear body, or perhaps a commission with a very clear agenda that assesses all these threats, not just from China, but any threat. Now, the EU is unity in diversity. Yes, it's not diversity in unity, which obviously complicates it. And as was mentioned before by Mr. Winkler, different interests, different geographic realities, different stages of economic development. So what Brussels systematically needs to do is it needs to address these concerns in Southern Europe, in Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. Now, these threats, I must add, are not just from China. Basically, the EU has threats in almost every wind direction, not necessarily the north, but from the west, the eroding relationship with the US, from the south, the issues in North Africa, in the southeast, Turkey, the Middle East, and instability there, in the east, Ukraine, Russia. Internally, obviously, certain levels of populism and disintegration. So it's a host of factors, of which China is one. Now, ideally, different US bodies, obviously including the European Parliament, should get together and should propose such a body or commission, I would say ASAP. Thank you.
Thank you, and over to you, Tim.
Yes, I can second everything that Richard said, so I will be very brief here. I think we shouldn't overestimate Europe's capacity to influence China. I think that is important to know. But we should always bear in mind there's I think 3 levels of effects that our China policy has. One is on China, and that's what I said might be limited. The second, I think, though, is internally. Do we stand up for values that Mr. Malosse has also called for? Has also an effect back on us Europeans. How do we see ourselves? What is our own identity? What does it make with Europe? And third, I think it also might have effects on third countries. How do they see? Is there an alternative to China? If not, Europe stands up against certain economic practices, against certain political values, then who else should? So I think we have to put that also into context here. But the question was also sort of, what do we have at our disposal? What should we do? Richard has referred to the issue of diversifying our supply chains. I would still say, well, Europe's market power, market access is still something we can leverage. And I would also say the status, China's international status, its reputation, does of course not only depend on Europe. But if you see Xi Jinping participating yesterday in a format that is supposed to be just one to be taken by Li Keqiang, then I think it is an expression of how serious Europe is being taken by China at this particular moment. Has to do with the situation in the United States, certainly. But I do think Europe is seen as sort of a credible actor in world affairs to give reputation or to withdraw reputation from China. That is something we can draw on. And I also second everything that has been said on EU cohesion, something that is not just important in relations to China, but also in relations to China. If I have 20 seconds, unfortunately, what Mr. Malosse has said was really difficult to follow, not acoustically difficult to follow due to technical issues. Well, as far as I understood, he was asking where is a more principled policy from the European Union. And I mean, I'm certainly the first to say that Europe has been really weak on in responding to the national security law. Weak apart from the European Parliament, of course, and also apart from Sweden. I'm not Swedish myself, so I can positively refer here to the country that hosts me at the moment, Sweden being the only country who put in the European Council sanctions against China onto the table. So I'm really disappointed with the EU's response, or the Commission and the member states' response to the Hong Kong issue, no doubt. Nonetheless, I do agree with some of what has been previously said, that we see Europe slowly moving away from this idea of constructive engagement and moving more into a more realistic view of China that hopefully, and it starts with Europe's own interest. It doesn't start in Hong Kong. It doesn't start in Tibet. It doesn't start in Xinjiang. I agree, and I share your impatience and your frustration about this. Nonetheless, I mean, I do see sort of Europe moving to get more realistic. That provides me at least a tiny bit of hope that we'll also get more principled on that. And as I said before, I think this would have positive effects on us Europeans too. So it's not just doing something for someone else. It would actually renew the European spirit, the European idea. So I'm absolutely supportive.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Richard. And we're really sorry that we're running out of time, so we don't really have the ability to cover all the questions here. But once again, it's been a very interesting debate and discussion throughout the last 2 years, last 2 hours and maybe 2 years, and on EU-China relations. And I'm pretty sure this debate will go on and on for the foreseeable future, given the increasing level of interest. And with this note, may I pass the floor back to Maddalena for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lau. Yes, I'm afraid we have come to the end of this panel. I would like to give special thanks to the moderator and to all the speakers for this insightful exchange and for contributing to the success of this event. I also would like to thank the audience for participating actively in the discussion. And if you want to know more about Vocal Europe's work, you can follow us. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And I just want to say thank you to all of you and have a good day.